What happens when a year of hard work, a billion dong of honest reward, and a quiet dream of family suddenly draw the eyes of people who have been waiting for the wrong moment? In today's emotional countryside story, Jack and Tu Tien finally hold in their hands the savings they have built through long months of farming, building, and patience. They plan to send part of it home to Mother Ly to expand their underground lotus pond and to share a little with those in need. But not everyone in the village receives the news with kindness. Through warm morning conversations, an unexpected visit from a distant relative, and a long quiet night that suddenly turns dark, the couple is reminded that the deepest threats sometimes come from the most familiar faces. What begins as a peaceful season of dreams quickly turns into a night neither of them will ever forget. The early sunlight slowly stretched across the wooden floor of the small farmhouse beside the underground lotus pond. The morning air was cool and gentle, carrying the soft scent of damp earth and blooming lotus from the water just outside the doorway. Jack sat at the simple wooden table, a worn cloth envelope opened in front of him, while Tu Tien poured warm tea into two small ceramic cups. The pale gold light caught the edge of her hair as she sat down beside him, her hand resting softly on her stomach, the way it had been resting for many quiet weeks now. They were not wealthy people, and they had never imagined themselves becoming wealthy people. The farm around them was small. The wooden house was simple. The lotus pond was the work of their own tired hands. Yet somehow, slowly, season after season, the life they had built together had begun to reward them in ways neither of them had expected. Jack carefully counted the soft stacks of bills inside the envelope one more time. 1 billion dong. The number still felt unreal to him. He looked up at Tu Tien with quiet, warm eyes. He said softly. We did it. Tu Tien smiled and took his hand. Her eyes were a little wet, but she did not let the tears fall. We did it together, Anne. Jack held her hand for a long moment. The cicadas in the trees beside the pond had begun their soft morning song. Somewhere behind the house, the chickens were quietly moving through the yard. I want to send a part of this home to Met, he said gently. Her roof has been worn for too many years, and I want to use another part to expand the lotus pond. We can dig the eastern side deeper, plant the new variety I have been reading about. Tu Tien nodded slowly. She rested her hand softly on her belly again. And An, I have been thinking, maybe we should also keep a small part to help others in the village, the people who are still struggling, quietly, as a way of asking heaven to bless our child. Jack looked at her for a long moment. His chest grew warm with the kind of love that had grown patient and steady over many years. Yes, he said quietly. We will do all three things. The morning light filled the small wooden kitchen as the two of them sat together, the warm tea between them, the soft sound of the lotus pond outside, and a quiet hope rising softly in their hearts. By the time the sun had climbed high above the fields, however, the village had already begun to whisper. News in the countryside travels in the strangest ways, through tea stalls and rice vendors, through the small market by the stream, through the elderly women who sit together under the old banyan tree. By late morning, the rumor had spread across nearly every roadside conversation. Jack and Tu Tien had received 1 billion dong. The young couple with the lotus pond had finally come into real money. The first visitors arrived just before noon. A small group of villagers, 3 or 4 of them, men and women whose faces Jack vaguely remembered from years before. They came down the dusty path toward the farm carrying baskets of fruit and small bottles of rice wine, their smiles too bright, their voices too eager, their words too sweet. On Jack, Tu Tien, one of them called out warmly, "We came as soon as we heard. Congratulations, congratulations. We always knew you two would do great things." Tu Tien stepped out onto the porch to greet them politely. Jack came up beside her, and offered the simple, respectful nod of a man who recognized people who had once turned their backs and were now suddenly remembering his name. The visitors sat down on the wooden benches by the porch. The conversation began softly enough: polite questions about the harvest, kind remarks about the new lotus blooms. But slowly, like water seeping through cracks in stone, the real reason for the visit began to surface. "On Jack," one of the men finally said, leaning forward with a small, embarrassed smile. "Actually, we came today because we have a small matter to discuss. My family is opening a new business in the next village. Just a small one. We were thinking, since you have just received such a wonderful blessing, perhaps you could lend us a little to help us begin." Family helping family. Of course we would pay you back. Of course. Tu Tien lowered her eyes gently. Jack's expression did not change. Another woman quickly added, "And actually, you know my late grandfather used to own a piece of land near where your lotus pond is now. Of course we never said anything, because you two were struggling. But now that things are different, perhaps it is only fair that our family receives a small share. Just enough to remember our grandfather by." Jack folded his hands on his knees. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he always spoke, slowly and with care. "Thank you for coming today. Tu Tien and I appreciate your visit. But the money we have received has already been planned for, every dong of it. We are sending part to my mother, we are expanding the pond, and we are setting some aside for our child. There is nothing left to lend, and there is no share to divide. The land is ours. The work was ours. I am sorry." The warmth in the visitors' faces vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The smiles tightened, the eyes hardened. One of the men leaned back with a slow, bitter laugh. "So that is how it is," he said softly. "After everything, you forget where you came from." The woman beside him stood up sharply. "Be careful, Jack. Having money and being selfish at the same time, that kind of life does not last long. You watch." The group rose together. They did not say goodbye. They walked back up the dusty path, the way people walk when they have come for one reason and are leaving with another. Tu Tien stood quietly at the porch and watched them go. The warm morning had quietly slipped away. She felt the small, uneasy tightness in her chest, but she said nothing. Jack put his hand softly on her shoulder. "It will pass, he said gently. "Words have no weight when the heart is clean." She nodded slowly, but somewhere behind her ribs, a small worry was already beginning to settle, the kind of worry no words could quite reach. The afternoon faded into evening. The sky above the lotus pond turned soft pink, then deep gold, then dark blue. The cicadas slowly grew quiet. The small kerosene lamp in the kitchen flickered warmly as Tu Tien and Jack ate a simple meal together. They spoke softly of the future, of the pond, of Ly's old roof, of the child who would soon arrive. By the time they went to bed, the moon was high and pale above the wooden house, and the lotus pond outside was perfectly still. Just past midnight, every light in the house suddenly went out. Jack opened his eyes in the darkness. The small clock by the bedside had stopped. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was gone. Outside the window, the moon was the only source of light, and it shone cold and pale across the lotus leaves drifting on the water. "On," Tu Tien whispered. Her voice was already trembling. "Stay here," he said softly. "Hide in the corner behind the wardrobe. Do not come out." He rose quietly from the bed and reached for the flashlight on the small table. From the back of the door, he took down a thick wooden stick he had kept there for years and never once used. The flashlight beam was thin and yellow as he moved slowly through the dark hallway. The wooden floor creaked softly under his bare feet. Somewhere at the back of the house, he could hear it now, the faint sound of metal scraping against the back door lock, and then the slow, careful footsteps of someone who had already entered. Jack stepped silently into the kitchen. The flashlight beam swept across the room, and there, in the corner by the cabinet where the envelope of money had been kept, two figures were crouching low. Black cloth masks covered their faces. One of them held a small bag in his hand. The other turned at the sound of Jack's breath. "On," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Put it down." The taller figure lunged at him. The flashlight fell. The wooden stick struck once, then was knocked aside. Jack felt himself thrown hard against the kitchen wall, his shoulders striking the corner of the table. He gasped, found his footing, swung again. The second figure pushed past him toward the back door. From the bedroom, Tu Tien heard the heavy thud of her husband hitting the wall. She forgot every word he had said. She ran out into the dark hallway calling his name. "On, Jack!" The taller figure turned sharply. His arm came up. The push was hard, panicked, careless. Tu Tien fell sideways. Her hips struck the low stone edge of the lotus pond just outside the open back door. The pain came immediately, sharp and deep and terrifying, and her hands flew to her stomach as she gasped. The shorter figure grabbed the bag of money and ran toward the broken back door. The taller one followed. As he ducked under the low branch of the old mango tree, the corner of his cloth mask caught on a small twig. The mask slipped down across his throat. The moonlight fell across his face. Jack pulled himself upright against the kitchen wall. His ribs were screaming. His vision was blurred. He looked toward the back door just as the man turned to free his mask, and for one terrible moment under the pale moon, Jack saw the face clearly. It was a face he knew, a face that had sat at his table, a face that had laughed with him only months ago. Jack made a sound that did not come from his mouth so much as from somewhere deeper, a sound that was half breath and half breaking. The two figures disappeared into the night, the bag of money swinging in the moonlight as they ran. Jack stumbled toward the back door. Tu Tien was on the ground beside the lotus pond, curled on her side, both arms wrapped around her belly, her face pale, her eyes wide and wet. She was making a small sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to scream. Jack whispered. He fell to his knees beside her. He gathered her gently against him. The lotus leaves on the water beside them moved softly in the night breeze, the pale moonlight reflecting in the still surface as if nothing at all had happened. But Jack was crying for the face he had just seen disappearing into the dark, crying for the woman he was holding, crying for the small life that was suddenly silent inside her. The cicadas in the trees had stopped singing. The pond was perfectly still, and under the pale countryside moon, the warmest home Jack and Tu Tien had ever known had become, in a single night, the loneliest place either of them had ever been.